For 3 winters, Ethan Cole had spoken to almost no one. Not because the mountains were too far from town, not because the road to his ranch was hard, but because silence was easier than grief. His wife was dead. His little girl was gone, and the ranch they had once filled with laughter had become a place where even the wind sounded lonely. The corral fence sagged like an old man's back. One broken slat had been hanging there for nearly a year, creaking softly whenever the wind pushed against it. The barn door leaned on a single hinge. Every time it moved, it gave a tired groan that echoed across the empty valley. The house itself looked smaller every winter, as if the land was slowly swallowing it. Ethan moved through his days the same way he had for years: slow, quiet, automatic. Feed the cattle, check the well, patch whatever the wind had broken during the night. He didn't hurry. There was no one waiting for him anymore. The silence on that ranch was not peaceful. It was heavy, like snow that never melted. Then one morning, something moved across the valley. Ethan noticed it from the kitchen window. At first, it looked like nothing more than a gray speck drifting across the white land. But the speck kept moving, slowly, stubbornly, step after step through the frozen Wyoming prairie. Ethan frowned slightly. People didn't come here, not by accident, not in winter. He lifted the tin cup in his hand, but forgot to drink. The figure grew closer. An hour passed, then another. Finally, the shape became clear. It was a woman, small, thin, walking alone through snow that reached nearly to her knees. Her dress was strange for this country, high-collared, gray, made from worn cloth that looked more suited for a city than the Wyoming frontier. It was a Chinese dress, one Ethan had only ever seen in photographs. Her steps were uneven. Twice she stumbled. Once she nearly fell completely into the snow. But each time she pushed herself back up and kept walking. In her arms she carried a small cloth suitcase. She held it tightly against her chest like it contained the last pieces of her life. Ethan felt something stir in his chest. Not kindness, something closer to unease. This valley was his refuge, his emptiness, his punishment. And now someone was walking straight into it. He stayed at the window as she reached the broken fence. She paused there for a moment, looking at the sagging barn, the crooked corral, the silent house. For a second, it seemed like she might turn around. Maybe she realized there was nothing here for her. But then she squared her shoulders and walked directly to his front door. The knock was soft, barely louder than the wind. Ethan didn't move. He waited, hoping she would give up, hoping she would disappear the same way she had appeared. The knock came again, a little stronger this time. With a slow breath, Ethan walked to the door and opened it. Cold air rushed inside. The girl standing there looked barely strong enough to remain upright. Snow clung to the hem of her dress. Her simple cloth shoes were soaked. Her hands trembled slightly from the cold. She was Chinese. Her dark hair was tied back loosely, her face pale with exhaustion, but her eyes were steady. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The winter wind moved quietly between them. Then she said in a hoarse but clear voice, "I am looking for work." It was not a plea, it was a statement. Ethan said nothing. He simply watched her. She glanced past him toward the broken corral, the leaning barn, the silent kitchen. "I can cook," she said quietly. "I can mend clothes. I can clean." A small tremor crossed her hands, but her voice remained steady. "Please, I have nowhere else to go." The words hung in the frozen air. Ethan felt something shift inside him, a dangerous thought, a reckless idea born from 3 years of silence. His voice, when it finally came, sounded rough from disuse. "I have no money to pay a hired hand." The girl lowered her eyes. It looked like the last of her strength had left her. She turned slowly toward the snow, ready to walk back into the winter. Then Ethan spoke again, the words leaving his mouth before he could stop them. "Only if you'll marry me today." The words hung between them like frost in the air. Leanne did not move. For a moment she simply stared at him, as if her mind could not quite understand what she had heard. Marry him? Today? This was not the kind of proposal she had once imagined as a girl. There were no flowers, no smiles, no warmth in his eyes. Only a tired rancher standing in a doorway and a winter storm creeping across the Wyoming mountains. Leanne slowly turned her head and looked out across the valley behind her. The snow stretched endlessly, white, silent, merciless. Somewhere beyond those hills was the last town that had turned her away, the place where doors had closed the moment they heard her accent, the place where men had stared too long and women had whispered even longer. She had walked for 2 days after that, 2 days with almost no food, 2 nights sleeping beneath frozen trees. And now she stood here, at the edge of a ranch that looked as broken as the man who owned it. Her eyes returned to Ethan. He was not smiling. He was not mocking her. If anything, he looked almost surprised by his own words. Leanne studied his face carefully, the deep lines around his eyes, the quiet heaviness in the way he stood. This was not a man offering romance. This was a man offering survival. A strange kind of bargain between 2 people who had nowhere else to go. If she refused, there would be nothing waiting for her out there but cold and hunger. If she accepted, she would belong to a stranger. But at least she would be alive. Leanne closed her eyes for a brief second. Then she nodded once, a small, sharp motion. Yes. Ethan blinked. For a moment he looked almost startled that she had agreed. But he said nothing. He simply stepped aside and gestured toward the stable. "We leave now." The ride to town was silent. The wind cut across the valley as they rode side by side through the frozen prairie. Ethan rode ahead, his shoulders stiff. Leanne followed on a slow old mare wrapped in a thick wool blanket he had given her. Neither of them spoke. There were no promises to exchange, no questions to ask, just the steady sound of hooves pressing into snow. The town appeared 2 hours later. A small cluster of buildings crouched against the winter wind. Smoke curled from a few chimneys. A handful of men stood outside the general store watching them ride in. Ethan avoided their eyes. He guided the horses directly toward a narrow office beside the sheriff's building. A crooked wooden sign hung above the door. Justice of the Peace. Inside sat an elderly man with watery eyes and a thick ledger on his desk. He looked up slowly when they entered. His gaze moved from Ethan to the small Chinese woman standing beside him. The old man sighed softly. He had lived in Wyoming long enough to know when questions were best left unasked. "Name?" he muttered, opening the ledger. "Ethan Cole." The old man dipped his pen into ink. "And the bride?" Leanne stepped forward slightly. Her voice was quiet but steady. "Leanne Zhao." The pen scratched across paper. The ceremony lasted less than 2 minutes. The justice read the words without emotion. Ethan answered when told. Leanne repeated the vows in careful English. When it was finished, the old man pushed the ledger toward them. "Sign here." Ethan signed first, his handwriting rough and heavy. Leanne took the pen next. Her characters curved gracefully across the page, different from anything the justice had ever seen. The old man closed the book with a dull thump. "Well," he said quietly, "you're married." Just like that. 2 strangers bound together by ink and winter. The ride back to the ranch was even quieter than the ride to town. The sky had begun to darken, snow clouds gathering along the mountains again. By the time they reached the ranch, the wind had started to rise. Ethan tied the horses and opened the door to the house. Inside it was dim and cold. The fire had burned down to a faint red glow. He stepped aside to let her enter, then pointed toward a narrow hallway. "There's a spare room in the back." Leanne carried her small cloth bag down the hall. The room was simple. A narrow bed, a small table, dust in the corners. But it had walls, it had a roof, and it was warm enough to survive the night. For the first time in weeks, Leanne allowed herself to breathe. Behind her, the rancher, who had just become her husband, closed the door, and the strange silence of their new life began. The next morning, Leanne woke before Ethan. For a moment, she did not remember where she was. The ceiling above her was unfamiliar. The room smelled faintly of dust and old wood. Then it came back to her. The long walk, the frozen valley, the strange rancher, and the marriage that had happened in less than an hour. Leanne sat up slowly. The house was silent. Too silent. She stepped into the hallway. Cold floorboards creaked beneath her feet. The kitchen looked exactly as Ethan had left it. A table covered in old dishes, grease on the stove, dust gathered along the windows. It was not the house of a lazy man. It was the house of a man who had stopped caring. Leanne stood there for a moment. Then she rolled up the sleeves of her dress. If she was going to live here, she would work. She began with the floor, scrubbing on her hands and knees with a bucket of water she carried from the well. Each stroke of the brush slowly revealed the pale wood hidden beneath years of neglect. By mid-morning, the kitchen window was open. Cold winter sunlight spilled across the room. Dust floated in the air like tiny sparks. Outside, Ethan returned from feeding the cattle. He pushed the door open with his shoulder, then stopped. The house smelled different, warm, clean, and something else. Bread. Ethan stood very still in the doorway. For a moment he thought he was imagining it. But then he saw her. Leanne stood by the stove, her sleeves rolled up. A small line of flour dusted across her cheek. She moved quietly through the kitchen as if she had lived there for years. The pot on the stove simmered slowly. Fresh bread cooled on the table. She noticed him standing there, but she did not stop working. Instead, she said softly, "Food will be ready soon." Ethan did not answer. He simply removed his hat and sat down. The stew was simple. Beans, salted beef, fresh bread still warm from the oven. But it was the best meal Ethan had eaten in a long time. He ate in silence. Leanne washed dishes quietly beside the sink. Neither of them spoke. But something in the room had changed. That evening, Ethan noticed something else. The broken cupboard latch had been repaired. His shirts were folded neatly on a chair, and the dying geranium by the window had been watered. The small plant looked less hopeless already. Days began to follow a new rhythm. Ethan worked outside. Leanne worked inside. She scrubbed walls, mended torn clothes, swept away cobwebs that had hung for years. Slowly, the ranch began to feel alive again. Ethan never thanked her. He did not know how. But he began fixing things she could not. A broken fence post, the loose barn hinge, the cracked window frame in the living room. It was never discussed, but they had begun working together. Two strangers quietly rebuilding the same place. Then, one afternoon, the sky changed. Dark clouds rolled over the mountains like a slow-moving wall. The wind grew sharp. Snow began to fall. By nightfall, the storm had swallowed the entire valley. The wind screamed across the ranch. Snow hammered against the windows. Leanne placed another log on the fire. Ethan stood by the window, watching the storm grow stronger. Outside, the world had disappeared. The ranch, the hills, everything buried beneath a roaring white wall. They were trapped. For 3 days, by the third day, the storm had become something alive. Wind slammed against the walls like a giant trying to break inside. Snow buried the barn doors halfway to the roof. The world beyond the windows no longer existed. Leanne was feeding the fire when she noticed Ethan standing very still by the kitchen window. His hand rested against the frost-covered glass. His eyes were fixed on something outside. "What is it?" she asked quietly. Ethan did not answer. Leanne stepped beside him and wiped a small circle in the frost with her sleeve. Through the swirling white storm, she saw it. A horse. A lone mare from the wild herd that roamed the hills. She had been driven down by the blizzard. Now she was trapped in a deep drift near the barn. The animal thrashed desperately. Each movement only buried her deeper in the snow. Her eyes rolled with panic. Her breath burst from her nostrils like smoke. Leanne felt her chest tighten. "She will die," she whispered. But Ethan did not move. Something had changed in his face. The color drained from it. His breathing slowed. He was not seeing the horse anymore. In his mind, the snow had become something else. Smoke, fire, screaming. A door that would not open. A child's voice calling his name. His hand trembled slightly against the glass. He was frozen, just as helpless now as he had been that night years ago. Leanne looked at him, then back at the struggling mare. Without saying a word, she moved. She grabbed Ethan's heavy winter coat from the hook by the door. The sleeves hung past her hands when she pulled it on. She wrapped a scarf around her face, then took the rope hanging beside the door. Ethan blinked. The sound of the door opening snapped him back to the present. Leanne stepped straight into the storm. The wind nearly knocked her sideways. Snow tore at her coat like claws. Ethan stared for half a second. Then something fierce surged through him. "Damn it!" He grabbed his own coat and followed her into the white chaos. The storm swallowed them instantly. Wind roared so loudly they could barely hear each other. Snow stung their faces like needles. The mare thrashed again as they approached, her legs buried deep in the drift, her body trembling with exhaustion. Leanne moved slowly toward the animal, her voice soft, steady. She began speaking to the horse in Chinese. "Shh, shh, it's all right." The words meant nothing to Ethan, but the tone did. The mare's frantic movements slowed slightly. Her ears flicked toward Leanne's voice. Ethan worked the rope around the horse's chest. Snow reached nearly to his waist. Every movement was heavy and brutal. "On 3, he shouted over the wind. Leanne nodded. She braced herself beside him, her small boots digging into the drift. 1, 2, 3. They pulled together. The first attempt failed. The mare slipped deeper. Snow collapsed beneath her weight. Leanne nearly fell. Ethan grabbed her arm before the wind could knock her down. Again! They tried once more, muscles burning, hands numb from cold. This time the mare found purchase. Her front legs kicked free, then her back legs followed. With a final desperate surge, the horse lunged forward out of the drift. All 3 of them collapsed into the snow, panting, shaking, alive. Slowly they guided the exhausted mare into the barn. The moment the doors closed, the storm became distant again, just a muffled roar outside the wooden walls. The horse stood trembling in the stall. Leanne stroked her neck gently, her voice low and calming. Ethan leaned against the stall rail, his chest rising and falling heavily. Snow melted from his coat onto the dirt floor. For the first time since Leanne arrived, he looked at her differently. Not as a stranger, not as a burden, but as someone who had just dragged him out of the past. Someone who refused to let him stay frozen inside it. The storm howled through the night, but inside the barn, something had finally begun to change. The storm finally passed 2 days later. When the sun returned, the valley looked like another world. Snow covered everything in a smooth white blanket. The mountains shone beneath a pale blue sky. For the first time in days, the wind was quiet. Ethan saddled the horses early that morning. They needed supplies: flour, salt, lamp oil. The ride to town felt different this time, not silent in the old way. Leanne rode beside him, wrapped in the same wool blanket. The rescued mare followed calmly behind them, stronger now, alive. When they reached the town, a few men stood outside the general store. They noticed Leanne immediately. Their eyes lingered too long. Their smiles were not friendly. "Well now," one of them muttered, "looks like Ethan Cole finally found himself a wife." Another man leaned against the railing. "Where'd you get her? Trade a cow for her?" Leanne kept her eyes forward. Her hands tightened slightly on the reins. Ethan heard the words, every one of them. 3 months ago, he would have ignored it. He would have turned away, gone silent, like always. But this time, he stepped forward. "That's enough." The men looked surprised. Ethan Cole had not spoken like that in years. "She's my wife," he said quietly, "and you'll speak about her with respect." The street fell silent. For a moment it looked like someone might argue, but the calm steadiness in Ethan's eyes made them hesitate. Finally, one man shrugged. "Was just talking." The men backed away, their laughter gone. Ethan opened the store door and held it for Leanne. A small gesture, but one that meant everything. That evening they returned to the ranch. The sky was turning gold as the sun dropped behind the mountains. Leanne went to the barn first. The rescued mare greeted her with a soft nicker. She brushed the horse slowly, the sound of the brush moving through the coat filling the quiet space. Ethan stood nearby, watching her. Finally he spoke, his voice rough, careful. There was a fire. Leanne stopped brushing, but she did not turn around. She listened. My wife and my daughter were inside. The words came slowly, like stones being lifted from deep water. I tried to reach them, but the roof collapsed. Silence filled the barn, the kind of silence that holds pain without trying to fix it. I built this place after that, Ethan continued quietly. Thought if I stayed alone long enough, maybe the guilt would stop. Leanne set the brush down. She walked toward him. For a moment she said nothing. Then she placed her small hand gently on his arm. Not to comfort, not to erase the past, just to say, "You are not alone." Winter slowly began to loosen its grip on the valley. Snow melted from the hills. Water returned to the creek. The dead grass pushed green shoots through the soil. The ranch changed too. The fence stood straight again. The barn door swung easily on new hinges. Smoke curled from the chimney every morning. The geranium by the kitchen window bloomed bright red. One evening Ethan found Leanne sitting by the fire, sewing. Her hands looked cold. Without thinking, he knelt beside her. He took her small hands in his own, rubbing warmth back into them. Leanne looked up. Their eyes met, and neither of them pulled away. From that moment forward, their marriage was no longer a bargain. It was something real. Spring arrived quietly. The mountains softened with green. The rescued mare ran freely in the corral. One evening, Ethan and Leanne stood together on the porch. The sky burned orange as the sun slipped behind the peaks. For a long time they watched the valley in silence. But it was no longer the lonely silence Ethan had once lived inside. Finally he spoke, softly. "I'm glad you knocked on my door that day." Leanne smiled, a warm, quiet smile that reached her eyes. "The silence here feels different now," she said. Ethan nodded, because he knew exactly what she meant. For the first time in years, his ranch was no longer a place of ghosts. It was home.